Well, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, no ingarangi oku tipuna, kei te noho au ahu ki o te tahi, ko Neil Boister, taku ingoa, no rere, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you to the Royal Society for inviting me to be a fellow, and I really, I must say, I express my sincere thanks for the invitation. I think that I pondered for some time about what I was going to talk about this afternoon, because amongst lawyers, I would be considered quite obscure, actually. Yeah, so I'm talking about an obscure area of the law to people who are not lawyers. And that's something of a, so I thought I'd talk about an area of research that I'm just starting to develop. But my main area is transnational criminal law, and I just want to make a few distinctions. So within international criminal law, as most of you understand it, is about the prosecution before international tribunals of individuals for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. And the classic trial is the Nuremberg trial, although the Tokyo trial, which I worked on extensively, is another example of the post-war criminal tribunals. The signal most important factor is that they are being held individually liable, not against the laws for breaches of a particular state's law, but of breaching international law itself. Now, that is not the area of my research, but I just wanted to put that to one side, because that fits within the much broader systems of international cooperation, which are also much older. This is, as well, 70, 75, 80 years old, international criminal law in its current form, and it's obviously highly controversial. You just have to read the newspapers to figure that out. I work on an area of international cooperation. So states have cooperated in pursuing criminals for thousands of years, and I want to give an example of that. This is a relationship between the Mari, who are in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, and Babylon back in, I think it was the 18th century BCE. So this is really old, actually. And it just shows the kind of international relationship when it came to the pursuit of fugitives, which prevailed at that point. It wasn't a relationship that paid any attention to the kind of crime that was committed in either jurisdiction. It was simply a relationship about handing people over who were wanted by the other jurisdiction. So it was fraught with the threat of political force. And this is an example. You can read it for yourselves, but the part that about handing someone over, a suzerain is instructing his vassal to hand someone over to him because he's going to hand it back because the man of Babylon has demanded him from me. And that's the nature of the relationship. It's just a blunt demand. The man of Babylon is obviously the king of Babylon, who I think was Hammurabi at that stage. But anyway, I'm not a historian. So you have this very crude system, but it sustained itself for many, many centuries. And then it takes a kind of leap forward in the middle part of the 19th century. And it related to counterfeiting in Brazil, not in Brazil, but of the Brazilian real by criminals based in Portugal. So they would counterfeit the real in Portugal and spend it in Brazil, and then take the ill-gotten gains back to Portugal, and they were completely immune from any form of prosecution. And what the Brazilian and Portuguese governments did was they struck the first treaty of the area of law that I'm specifically interested in, which basically they agreed not only to cooperate by handing over individuals, but also to align their criminal laws so that they were similar. So they had similar offenses in a transnational relationship to make that cooperation much more productive. And that is the first. It's a bilateral treaty. It's the first example that colleagues of mine and I could find of such a relationship. So you just start to see it in a comparative situation, criminal laws in different countries slowly beginning to be pulled into the similar shape. I'm not saying identical. This is not about harmonization of law. That was a dream in the 1920s, which was never realized. Then it moves forward to, so I'm just jumping through time here to try to give you an example of where we are at the moment. This is the scope of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, which is something that I've worked on quite a lot. It's 25 years old this year. It is a multilateral treaty with more than 340 articles, many subparts to it. It's a very complex arrangement where New Zealand is party to that treaty, and we have arranged our criminal law to suit all the other parties to the treaty. So we basically promised to create a whole range of new offences, money laundering offences, participation in an organised criminal group, which if you listen on the radio, you will hear being used more and more these days against biker gangs and various individuals involved in organised criminal groups. There's no such thing as organised crime in the law. But a point I wanted to make was the global reach of this thing. It's almost universal in terms of its scope. The multilateral context is quite light, but the consequences for the criminal laws of the various states is quite significant. We instituted money laundering laws as a result of becoming party to this treaty. So our law is beginning to be formed by these relationships. In the background is the global policeman. Now, it used to be Great Britain in the 19th century, but we all know the global policeman was the United States for most of the 20th century. And on the whole, the United States has been a positive sponsor of these arrangements. So it's worked very hard in multilateral fora to try to get these treaties to stand up and to work. So it's spent an enormous amount of its own money on the diplomacy that has to go in, track 2 diplomacy that has to go on in order to make all these sorts of arrangements possible. And every so often it has acted unilaterally. It has kidnapped individuals from Mexico back in the 1970s and 80s. But these were aberrations rather than the norm. That was certainly not the way that it was a supporter of this emerging system of transnational criminal law. In fact, the key supporter, because without it, it's probably doubtful that it would have emerged. And then you see this change in the last few months, unfortunately. It's not, and that's something that I think I'm going to try to explore at my next sabbatical. I think it has to be a change that actually has its roots much earlier than that. There's something going on here which is starting to. But this is just one example. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a piece of US legislation which was passed in 1973, and it's about the criminalization of bribery of an official in a foreign country, mostly by big corporations, so large-scale, long transnational bribery. And we've enacted an offence and never prosecuted it in New Zealand. We've had 15 investigations, and 2 have got close, but we've never prosecuted a New Zealand company for doing this. But the US were assiduous in the prosecution of this, except this year they've suspended it out of nowhere. It's an absolute shock. They've just suspended its operation. One of Trump's executive orders. And that's left the world of transnational criminal lawyers like gasping, what the heck is going on here? It's a strange situation. But that's not really, so there's just one example. They've also removed corporate transparency obligations on US-based corporations, but not on foreign corporations. And all these sorts of little activities are going on underneath the radar, which I suppose is the point that I wanted to make this afternoon. You know, they very recently, the US has expelled large numbers of alleged Venezuelan and Central American gangsters to El Salvador, to that very large prison that they've helped finance. But what they don't illustrate, what we don't see a lot of is things like this, that they were, in fact, the Mexicans have handed 29 of their own citizens over to the United States who were in legal process at the time. So they were subject to legal process, extradition requests. Some of them had been under these processes for a very long time. They were in Mexican jails and they were just expelled to Mexico. The justification was that they were a threat to the Mexican state, but the justification is actually they wanted to try to strike a deal and avoid tariffs, and they didn't. Actually, they got the tariffs anyway. These individuals now, 6 of them are potentially facing the death penalty, no extradition. So there's no, because if there had been an extradition, the US would have had to promise the Mexicans not to apply the death penalty, or else the Mexican government would not have agreed to the extradition. And I suppose that's where I think I'm going to leave you. I'm about to run out of time. But I'm beginning to wonder whether we're returning to a situation where the man, perhaps not in Babylon, but in Mar-a-Lago, when he asks, we hand over. You know, is that where is that the situation we're moving into? And I suppose that's what I mean by the problems of transnational criminal law in the New World disorder. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions. Does anybody have anything they want to ask? I think this man, that comes a time, comes a man. I think you got a lot of research to do in that next while. Does anybody want to ask anything?
Very interesting. Has there been any changes to New Zealand law recently?
No, I think the answer is no. You know, we are in a long-term process, for example, with Mr. .com, who I think you'll remember was arrested in 2012. And 13 years later, he probably will go quite soon, actually. I think the chances that he will disappear quite soon are very high. But please don't quote me on that. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't mind, actually. They've signed the warrant, etc. You know. So I think that he's on a whole processes of judicial review. But I suppose the question will come is, what will we do? The US are not the only country that does this. The China has been doing it to the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, etc. They just ask, hand this person over. Now, China has asked us through the extradition process, and we are in the process of extraditing someone to China. And it's been held up in the courts. What will happen when they say, well, you know, if you don't, there are going to be consequences, and we're in the same situation the Mexicans are in? What will we do? I don't think the government has an answer to that.